This is the Evercade, and at first glance, it looks like another emulator-based multi-game handheld, but there's a twist. It uses actual cartridges. Now, I get it. Once you dive into the world of emulation devices, it becomes all too easy to consider dumping a full set of ROMs onto an SD card and calling it a day, but the more curated approach taken here has some nice benefits as well. Beyond this, there's also some interesting choices made behind the scenes that ensure a level of emulation quality beyond what I expected. So with this in mind, I wanted to put together a video exploring the physical Evercade hardware, its performance, and its library. For this video then, Blaze sent us an Evercade test unit and a stack of games to put through its paces, and hopefully by the end, you'll feel that we've done just that. So, without further ado, let's get started. With its 4.3-inch LCD screen and bright exterior, the Evercade makes a nice first impression. It's a chunky handheld with 4 face buttons, a pair of shoulder buttons, and a surprisingly decent D-pad. It's also rather chunky, which is perhaps its best design feature. It's really comfortable. Now, handheld systems have been increasingly focusing on thin design, but I feel this kind of reduces overall comfort, especially with buttons pushed out to the edge. The Evercade, though, is a thick machine that sits more comfortably in the hand as a result of this thickness. It has a nice weight as well, and doesn't really feel like a cheap hollow device like I expected. The red and white color combination also reminds me of certain variations of the Nintendo 2DS, but nicer looking. Now, the system includes the expected inputs and outputs, including a micro USB charging port, a 3.5-inch mini jack for headphones, and a mini HDMI output for playing the system on your television. Inside, the Evercade features a 1.2 GHz Cortex-A7 SoC running a customized Linux setup. The 4.3-inch screen offers a resolution of 480 by 272, just like the PSP as well. Battery life is listed around 4 to 5 hours, which is consistent with my experience as I ran the battery dry 3 times during capture. Now, the OS itself isn't designed to be used without carts. Turn on the system without a cart inserted, and this is what you get. Now, what's interesting about the device then is that all emulation software and games live on these carts. Insert one, and it loads up super quick with a slick menu design that is very responsive and easy to navigate. The carts themselves contain the emulators and games stored using flash memory. But what makes these carts so appealing is the overall packaging design. The games ship in these plastic cases complete with full color manuals within. The quality of the packaging is surprisingly high and recalls systems from the past. So it's quick and easy to set up, feels great in the hand, but there are a couple critiques I have regarding the hardware functionality. Firstly, I ran into an odd issue when using HDMI output. If I started the unit with a certain type of cable plugged in, and I have a couple of them, I could hear an audible squealing noise from the internal speaker. The solution I found was to simply power on the unit first, then plug the HDMI cable in, but it's strange that this should be necessary at all. Secondly, the viewing angle on the internal LCD isn't great. Tilting the unit forward or backward reduces visibility significantly, suggesting a cheaper TN panel. Now, it's not a huge deal during normal play, but it is worth noting nonetheless. At least LCD blur is kept to a reasonable level. Motion resolution is superior to all iterations of the PSP, for instance. Still, the overall hardware itself feels well made and is enjoyable to use despite these flaws. The most important element, however, lies in performance. While emulation seems trivial these days, very few devices really get this right. Delivering high-quality software emulation requires a mix of accurate, fast software, attractive scaling options, and minimal input latency. In its current form, the Evercade emulates several different consoles, including the NES, Super NES, Sega Genesis, and Atari 8-bit consoles. Of course, since the emulator software itself is included on the cartridge as opposed to built in the system, additional platforms can be added at a later date. One of the upcoming packs, for instance, features Atari Lynx games, and there are others in the works as well, including actual arcade emulation. The one I found most interesting is in fact the Sega Genesis emulation, because the Evercade makes use of the emulator Blastum. For those unfamiliar with Blastum, it's a psycho-accurate emulator on the PC, offering exceptional performance, and stands as one of the only emulators capable of running advanced demos, such as Titan Overdrive 2. Simply put, it's one of the best Sega Genesis emulators ever made. And now it's available on the Evercade. I asked the author of Blastum, Michael Pavone, what was required to port the game to run on a quad-core Cortex A7-based system like the Evercade. And despite shifting to a low-power SoC setup, Michael noted that this version is rather close to the x86 release in terms of overall accuracy. Even Titan Overdrive 2 still runs on the Evercade, though a couple of the scenes now apparently exhibit minor glitches. This is due primarily to a change in synchronization between components. Blastum typically uses a sync on demand, but it's not flawless, so a forced sync occurs at a set interval. The x86 version syncs once per line, but this was changed to once every 8 lines for the Evercade. This should have no real effect on commercial games though, so it's just an interesting thing to note. The Evercade release also features a new audio-video backend designed for mobile hardware, which pulls emulation off the CPU thread responsible for submitting new frames to the GPU. Even with these changes then, this version of Blastum is basically the most accurate emulator available on a mobile platform. During side-by-side comparisons, I found that the emulation quality was extremely high as well. Listen to this sound demo here from Earthworm Jim to get a better understanding of how the most difficult aspect to emulate of the Genesis, the audio, stacks up between a real VA6 Sega Mega Drive console and the Evercade. It sounds very close, right? How about another music demonstration then, this time using Midnight Resistance. Again, it sounds very accurate to the original game running on real hardware. And this same level of accuracy is also true when it comes to the visual side of things. The Genesis games included in this collection all look and run as expected without any visible glitches that tend to crop up in these emulation-based handhelds. They look, sound, and play great, which is key. And that brings us to another important feature, the input latency, which is kept to an absolute minimum and manages to feel much more responsive than any of the various mini consoles I've tested in recent years. Now, I do have a few nitpicks here, but this ties more into how the emulators are configured as opposed to the emulation itself, and we'll get to that shortly. So how about the other systems then? Well, it's not clear which emulators are in use, but the result is similarly great with each console. The visuals are glitch-free and audio sounds spot on. Comparing the emulation to real hardware demonstrates how close they are. Let's start with Super NES. And how about the NES? As you can hear, the sound is basically identical in both cases, which is great, but in the case of the NES, you can see how the palette varies. In this case, I'm using the Analog NT Mini with the lovely Firebrand X palette, which I feel produces pleasing colors that don't stray too far from what you might see via composite video. In comparison, the Evercade seems to use the PlayChoice 10 Rgb Color Palette, which can appear somewhat garish in comparison, and there is no option for adjusting this. This stems from the old issue where the NES does not natively generate its image in RGB internally. It relies on the display device. But there was RGB for the NES back in the day, at least in the arcades. This is where the PlayChoice 10 machines came into play, and for a while users would pull the picture processing unit from these PlayChoice 10 machines and use them in NES consoles. It's a topic beyond the scope for this video, but you can see that the Evercade at least seems closest to the PlayChoice 10 RGB palette. Now, I haven't really touched much on the Atari support as I'm much less of an expert on this system, but based on my tests, it does at least seem to match up accurately as you might expect. Now, the Evercade is designed around these removable cartridges, as I mentioned earlier, which also limits our testing to the games included. We can't put these emulators through the same torture tests as, say, the Mega SG. In this case, however, the key takeaway here is that the included games all run correctly. The quality of the emulation is a step above other various portable console systems out there, especially where the Genesis is concerned. Plus, the cart design means that we'll see other systems emulated in the future. So yeah, at this point I feel that the emulation quality is one of the system's strongest points. It's clear that the creators poured a lot of thought into how to tackle software emulation, and it shows. Unfortunately, there are some drawbacks, and each of these stem from the limited set of options available for tweaking your experience. Firstly, let's talk about controls. Buttons cannot be individually configured, and that means that the default setup doesn't always quite work, at least for me. With NES games, for instance, A and B are mapped to the corresponding buttons, which kinda makes sense on the surface, but I would have preferred X and A, as they're easier to press in unison. Genesis games also make use of A, B, and Y, which again, I don't feel is entirely the natural choice here. Super NES is fine, of course, as the button layout matches, but it can be an issue with other platforms. At least some games do allow you to adjust button configuration from the options menu. But the other more significant issue stems from the video output options. Pop open the menu within a game and you only have a 4:3 option and a stretched 16:9 option, and that's it. The issue here is that there aren't any adjustments for scaling the image to your liking, and honestly the default isn't brilliant, though it does vary between the internal LCD and HDMI output, as we'll discuss in a moment. The 480 by 272 pixel LCD screen doesn't quite fit any of these games. I mean, technically the pixels will fit, but if you want to fill the image, you need to scale, and that's exactly what we have here. In scaling the image to either full screen or 4:3, the developers have opted to use some light interpolation. Shimmering is generally kept to a minimum in most cases, but you will definitely notice it on vertical scrolling in certain Genesis games. Any areas with a tight grid pattern like this section in Earthworm Jim exhibit noticeable issues as a result of uneven scaling. This is a problem that PSP owners faced for years when dealing with emulation of older games, and it's basically the same problem here. Only this time there is no 1:1 pixel option to overcome the problem. Instead, you're left with a somewhat soft looking image. Basically, I feel the LCD choice and the options don't really mesh that well, and image quality isn't quite where I'd like it to be. That said, the choice does start to make sense when considering the broad focus of the device. There's the upcoming Atari Lynx pack, for instance, and that system features a wider aspect ratio, which will utilize more of the screen. Plus, there's potential for other applications in the future. So I can definitely understand that. Now, the HDMI output, however, fares better. The system displays at 720p with mostly solid scaling options. It's very similar to recent mini consoles in that there is some slight shimmering visible on 256 pixel wide games, but it's not too severe most of the time. In that sense, the HDMI output works surprisingly well. Overall though, I still would have liked to have seen more advanced scaling options included, allowing users to tweak the image beyond the default. That's really my single biggest issue with the system. If we step back and look at the big picture though, a lot of this all starts to make sense. The Evercade will sell for $80 with one pack-in game, or $100 with 3 pack-in games, while each game will cost $20. They're really targeting a budget price here, so in that sense it's a little easier to forgive some of its shortcomings. In fact, given the price, the build quality is really quite good. And that's where the idea of collecting games for the system becomes even more interesting. It's not a huge investment, and it is kind of fun to collect these little carts. The thing is, as I mentioned earlier, it might seem strange to go back to this cartridge medium when you could just drop an entire set of ROMs on an SD card with any other portable unit. But in reality, there is a method to this madness. Beyond the collectability aspect, I found that by focusing on a smaller selection of games, it becomes easier to enjoy each one. At least for me, a giant list of ROMs is almost just paralyzing, and I wind up not playing anything at all. Clearly, this isn't going to appeal to everyone, but the execution is strong enough that I can see the Evercade finding an audience, and I hope it does. As for the lineup itself, well, I do appreciate some of the games brought to the table. For instance, there's 2 Namco Museum titles here, right? Well, rather than just trotting out the same selection of games from the past, we have other stuff like Libble Rabble, the Splatterhouse games, the vertical shooter Phelios on the Sega Genesis, Burning Force, also ported to the Genesis, and Mappy Kids, a platformer based on Mappy which was not previously localized. Yes, some of the Namco staples are here as well via their console ports, but I think it's great to see some additional variation on what Namco Museum can offer. I'm also a fan of the Mega Cat Studios cart, which includes 10 games. Mega Cat is known for releasing new games designed for old systems, and that's exactly what we have here. A whole slew of original titles that you may not have experienced before on a single cart, and there's some real gems here too. The Interplay collections are also enjoyable with some great titles included, such as Earthworm Jim 1 and 2, which also kind of highlights how many of these ROMs needed to be modified for this version to add new copyright information or remove company logos. The Nintendo logo visible during the boot up of Earthworm Jim 2, for instance, has been removed. Basically, while the lineup lacks some of the more traditional heavy hitters, there's still plenty of great stuff to enjoy and explore. That's going to do it for this episode though. Hopefully you enjoyed this tour of the Evercade and have a deeper understanding of what this system brings to the table. It does have its flaws for sure, but it's a fun little device that offers some unique ways to revisit classic games in a modern form. The cartridge system may not appeal to everyone, but the packaging is quite nice and the price of everything is really affordable, so in that sense it can definitely be worth a look if this is the kind of thing that sounds fun to you. Now if you enjoyed this video, as always, be sure to give us a like and subscribe, ring the notification bell for instant updates, and of course come follow us over on Twitter. And until next time, stay retro. You